Okay, now that we've given an overview of kind of the importance of vision, mission, and then strategy, what that means to the organization and creating that clarity, not just for the person who founded the company, but for everybody else that works in it, and giving that kind of that guidance, that clarity in terms of what we're working towards. Now we're going to dive into strategy. So before we get into the different types of strategy and how we should and can be thinking about strategy, there was a very interesting survey that was done. Now this is a little bit older, but I think that it still pertains today. So as we think about organizations and how much time is actually spent looking into the future and looking at innovation and new market opportunities, versus looking at improving day-to-day operations and managing the work that's in front of us and probably consuming the majority of our time, I think it sheds a lot of light on one of the problems that a lot of existing organizations have is that once you get entrenched in doing work in a particular industry, it takes a lot of effort to take that time and to think, beyond the work that you're doing now, and to be able to break down those assumptions about who your current clientele, your customer base is, who it could be, and what that would require in terms of innovation, new service, or product offerings. So this survey that was done through the INSEAD Institute in France asked a number of Fortune 500 companies what percent of your organization's time is spent on external rather than internal issues. So understanding implications of new technology, finding new market opportunities, understanding what the futurists are projecting, versus debating cost allocations, overhead, budget, scheduling, those day-to-day things that challenge us and that we have to deal with. So asking, again, the companies, individuals, executives in these companies, the percent in which they spend their time, again, thinking externally versus managing external issues. So of that time spent looking outward, of all that time that you spent thinking about the future, what percent is spent considering how the world will be different in 5 to 10 years? So really trying to think through what it's, how the industry is changing, but also how our consumers are changing and their expectations, and how we can get out in front of that. So then the third question is, of the time devoted to looking outward and ahead, so 5 to 10 years in advance, what percent of that time is spent working with staff to build a deeply shared, well-tested view of the future? So one of the kind of tripping points for many organizations is, even if they're looking out and thinking creatively and innovatively about future market spaces, opportunities to deliver new goods or services, oftentimes there's not this kind of reflective component in terms of how can we then refine our mission, our values to correspond with that new vision, and how are we going to bring all of our team members on board so we're all working towards the same goals. So this was the survey that was done, and these were the findings. Now it follows what we're calling here is a 40-30-20 rule. So they found that 40% of the time people said they spent looking outward, so looking at things that were happening in the external environment rather than internally. Of that 40% of the time they spent looking outward, executives said about 30% of that time is really looking into the future, 5 to 10 years. So instead of just managing competition in the industry, about 30% of that time spent looking outward is really looking into the future. And of that time spent looking into the future, right, looking out, thinking about value creation in the future, what that could look like, about 20% then of that time is spent coming back and building that shared and collective view of what that future could look like, and what the impact on the organization will be if we want to try to move in that direction. So given that breakdown, what that really means, and I think that this is probably a little bit generous too, because these were, this was, their own responses in terms of how much time they felt they spent. So that would mean that management spends less than 3% of their time building a distinctive strategic view of the future that is then shared with everybody in the organization to create that path forward. Right? Because if you've got 40% of the time, then 30% looking externally, 30% of that time is looking into the future, and only 20% of that time then is spent creating that kind of alignment with the organization. That's really less than 3% of the time that management is really working on strategic growth and management. So that is certainly an opportunity that we have to change the way we're thinking about again, the goods and services we deliver, how we can create that value for our customers. And I see this with the organizations I work with as well too. Again, once you've worked in an industry for so long, you have a product or service, it's really hard to break down those assumptions and try to think into the future about what could be delivered to, for the benefit of your customers and also for the benefit of society and the industry as a whole. So there are two main types of strategy approaches. The book, and I love the book that we use again, but it really only talks about red ocean strategy, which is that competitive strategy. And there's something on the flip side called blue ocean strategy. And it's not necessarily to say one is better than the other. I think that they are complementary, and you can and should be thinking about both of these types of strategies. Blue ocean strategy is really kind of that innovation, that creative space where you're finding new market opportunities and meeting demands for delivering goods or services that currently aren't being met. So that's all new demand. It's not a zero-sum game in terms of, if you're able to break into that market, it's going to be to the detriment of somebody else or some other organization. But there are lots of opportunities where you can break into a completely new space, and the opportunities are endless. Red ocean strategy, on the other hand, is when you're trying to find a strategic direction in an industry that has a lot of competition, which usually means you're going to have to beat out your competitors in terms of cost, being able to provide some sort of differentiation, something that's unique and different, or response, right? Having very responsive customer service or being able to deliver a customized product or good very quickly to the consumer. So two different ways that we're going to be thinking about strategy. In thinking about blue ocean strategy, it's really important to, during the creative process and looking in the external environment, and looking out again 5 to 10 years, and thinking about your existing customers, but then more importantly, all of the people who aren't customers right now, and why aren't they customers? So if we even take an example of the local market, right, you can think about your current market base. You could think about soon-to-be customers, so maybe people who are moving into the area or who are on, in the adjacent town, who, maybe with some marketing opportunities or reduced costs, you could bring them in to start shopping at your store. The second tier then are people that refuse. So there may be people who say, I only want to shop at Trader Joe's or Whole Goods. I'm not going to shop at the local market. They don't have the quality of produce or the organic kind of products that I want or need. And then the third tier is completely an unexplored space. So this would be customers that you maybe never even considered before. So again, if you're thinking about a market, and this is me just putting my assumptions on it, and assuming that they're going to continue to provide kind of groceries, more produce, things of that nature. You could think about maybe, a younger clientele where, they're either eating at home with their parents, or maybe they're college students and eating out a lot, or, working long hours, right? Those are the people that they're not refusing to come here, but it's just a market that you haven't been able to tap into, right? So it's kind of using that framework to think about, how can we think about 5 to 10 years out externally in the environment, what's happening, what do our customers want, what are these people that are not currently customers, and what can we do to kind of create that value for them?